It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. Welcome, dear viewers, to the proper beginning of the KOTOR special. The first step on the journey that leads inevitably to two of the greatest Star Wars games ever made. Since I covered a lot of the early conception and development of the comic in the primer video, there's going to be a lot fewer production details in subsequent videos going forward. Partly because these details are stretched over a 50-issue series, and also partly because I don't want to give away certain spoilers too early. I'm not going to mention John Jackson Miller as much because he is the writer for the entire series. I'm going to place more attention on the artists as this series goes through several over the course of its run. In this instance, the artist's chair is occupied by Brian Ching, a regular comic book artist for Star Wars, as well as DC and Marvel. He would ultimately go on to do interiors for 21, nearly half of the issues in this series, and at least a quarter of the covers, though not the 6 chapters that comprise Commencement. That distinction belongs to Travis Charest. So, the year is 3964 BBY. The place is Taris, a small urban world on the Outer Rim, right next door to the Hydian Way, the longest of the 5 major hyperspace trade routes. Only recently inducted into the Old Republic, Taris is a prosperous world, although some of its people have cause for concern, given that Taris's home sector, the Aljuster sector, happens to be right next door to the Mandalore sector. But for now, the idea of war seems far away. Certainly it is the farthest thing from the mind of our young hero, Zayne Carrick, a well-meaning but tragically inept Jedi Padawan. At this moment, his greatest concern is trying, for the umpteenth time, to arrest the Snivian conman Marn Hierogriff. Bit of an interesting note. Apparently, the Griff, as he likes to call himself, was originally intended to be an Ortolan, but then Brian Ching realized that the Ortolan's distinctive trunk would make it hard to convey facial expressions, so they changed it to a Snivian instead. At any rate, when he's not scamming people, Griff works as a fence for misplaced goods. And when Zayne isn't getting in his way, he does a good business in it. This is because most of the crime on Taris falls under the patronage of the various swoop gangs that call the world home. Griff, however, works independently. This means that he doesn't have to charge nearly as much for his goods because he doesn't have to make any kickbacks to non-existent sponsors. At any rate, Zayne catches Griff in the act of trying to sell illicit spice and alcohol to some buyers, and Miller's excellent writing comes to the fore, explaining to the reader in only a few lines of dialogue that this isn't the first time these two have tangoed. It's also made pretty clear that the reason Zayne has yet to effectively capture Griff is because 1. The Snivian is very clever at finding his way out of situations, and 2. Zayne's aptitude with the Force is pretty bad. The scene is both fun and character establishing. My only criticism with it is that it renders the issue 0 kind of pointless, as that issue is basically just a rehash of this scene. They did a similar thing with an issue 0 for Golden Age of the Sith, but at least that depicted different events than this. At any rate, as if failure to fulfill his assignment wasn't bad enough for Zayne, he then gets soaked in foul-smelling lum ale and falls several stories before crashing through a window. I actually checked Wikipedia when I saw this scene, and nowhere does it mention that the Jedi can use the Force to enhance their resistance to physical damage. Energy attacks and blaster bolts, sure, but not blunt force trauma. Please mention in the comments section if there's just something I'm missing, because otherwise I'm going to have to call this a "that's not how the Force works" moment. Even if it does, given Zayne's ineptitude with the Force, it still kind of makes this a little unbelievable. I mean, 3 air speeders in a window? At the very least, the kid should have broken bones. Zayne's bad luck continues to get worse, as it turns out the room he just trashed was hosting a venue held by the 5 Jedi Masters assigned to Taris, including his own mentor, Lucian Dre. It is interesting to note here that KOTOR the comic, which takes place 30 years after the Tales of the Jedi comic, takes place during and does in fact depict pretty well the fact that the Jedi Order was transitioning into the form that we know so well in the Clone Wars era. And once again, Miller is clever enough of a writer to show this through character interaction rather than an exposition dump. Zayne's conversation with his fellow Padawans reveal that the Jedi Order has not yet gotten to the point where emotional attachments are verboten, as Zayne is still in regular contact with his family, and apparently there's nothing wrong with him having a crush on one of his fellow Padawans' sister. However, there is already the use of the term Padawan to refer to a Jedi apprentice, the braid as the symbol of that apprenticeship, and the fact that it's now one master, one pupil, whereas back in Tales of the Jedi, masters like Thawne, Arkajeth, and Vodo Siosk Bask had 2 or more apprentices. Speaking of Padawans, it turns out that the party Zayne so rudely interrupted was intended to be a prelude to a knighting ceremony. Zayne is of course happy that his friends and fellow students will advance to full Jedi, but is pretty convinced that at this point the likelihood of him being knighted are slim to none. To his credit, he isn't so disappointed by that likelihood that he's resentful of the others. While the pupils chatter, the 5 masters, Lucian, Zamar, Canilia, Feln, and Rana Te, have their own conversation, though it is a bit more vague and ominous. Something about transition and secret communiques with Coruscant. At any rate, Zayne is left behind to compensate the owner of the venue for the damage he's caused before he can come to the knighting ceremony. However, he spots Griff out a window, and perhaps hoping to win some last-minute approval from his stern master Lucian, goes after the Snivian, and wonder of wonders, actually catches him on his 9th try. So Zayne flies off to the local Jedi temple, hoping that he isn't too late, ready to report the good news, and he finds all 4 of his fellow Padawans dead, with the 5 masters standing over them with drawn lightsabers. His response is perfectly understandable. Mind you, this last frame is the end of issue 1, so this is basically a cliffhanger. And what a cliffhanger it is. KOTOR the comic was a monthly series, so I can only imagine how much tension and excitement fans had to go through as they waited a whole month to find out what the hell is going on. Chapter 2 opens with a brief flashback to Zayne and the other 4 Padawans undergoing initial youngling training at a Jedi facility on Dantooine, all under the supervision of Jedi Master Vandar Takar. The Master is assuring Zayne's mother that although Zayne might not have the best aptitude with the Force, he still likely has a future with the Jedi. The Master assures her that being in the Jedi Order is about as safe as one can be. After all, the Masters are not just the instructors of their students, but their protectors as well. Smash cut to Zayne fleeing from the scene of the murder of 4 Padawans by their teachers. A bit obvious to be sure, but then there's no law anywhere that says dramatic irony has to be subtle. Zayne manages to make it to his speeder, dragging Griff along into the mess as well, and after a desperate speeder chase, they barely manage to lose the Masters in the lower levels of Taris City. There's a pretty great scene afterwards where Zayne tries to convince Griff that he isn't the one behind the murders, pointing out that he was the least competent of them all, and thus there's no way he could have killed all 4 even if he'd wanted to. Griff, more than any other sentient being on Taris, ought to know this, since he was able to escape from Zayne 8 times out of 9. While he's talking, it looks as if Griff is about to cut Zayne down with his own lightsaber, clearly not believing him, only to then cut down a Taris security drone. Since they couldn't immediately catch the renegade Padawan, the 5 Jedi Masters have immediately decided to go to the local authorities and get them involved. This is confirmed by the fact that there are already wanted bulletins out for the pair of them. Despite the fact that KOTOR the comic goes to some pretty dark places at times, Miller knows exactly how to weave in the occasional moment of humor and levity without compromising the tone. One of my favorite jokes in the comic series is how Griff gets all offended by the fact that the wanted ads for him label him as a mere accessory to Zayne's murder. Accessory? Small-time hood? I'm not an accessory! I am a mastermind! Just occurred to me, if this comic is ever adapted, either get Wallace Shawn to voice Griff or else someone that can do a very good Vizzini impression.
The most famous is never get involved in a land war in Asia, but only slightly less well known is this: never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line.
At any rate, it's lucky for Zayne that Griff is willing to help him in spite of everything. And he's already got a cunning plan that might help them escape the Jedi and get off-world. Because frankly, Taris is no longer safe for either of them at this point. The plan actually works out brilliantly, though not for the reasons Griff intended. They pay some Wookiees to let them hitch a ride in their trash wagon, and Griff tells Zayne that their plan is to evade the Jedi by going below the lowest level of Taris itself into the undercity, which pretty much every urbanized planet in Star Wars seems to have. However, Zayne falls asleep, understandably exhausted by all that's happened, and when he wakes up, Griff informs him that that actually wasn't the plan at all. While Zayne was napping, Griff created a decoy trail leading to one of the entrances to the Undercity, which by now they've already passed. The real plan is for the Wookiees to take them to the outskirts of Taris City, where they'll meet Griff's contact that can get them off-world. The thing is, Griff doesn't expect his decoy plan to delay the Jedi for very long. For, besides being dark and easy to get lost in, the Undercity is infested by hordes of a particularly nasty type of flesh-eating beastie called rock ghouls. Griff reasons that their pursuers must be smart enough that once they see the trail leading into the Undercity, they'll reason no one's dumb enough to actually go down there to escape, which means they'll start looking again and eventually find their real trail. What Griff doesn't know is that the Jedi Masters, apart from Lucy and Dre, are very skilled in the mind powers of the Force. After some meditation, the other four are able to pinpoint the fugitives, and they overhear Griff telling Zayne that they're going into the Undercity. Confident that their Force abilities has led them directly to their quarry, at least 4 of the Masters actually do end up going into the Undercity and have to fight their way through hordes of rat ghouls before they finally realize that neither Padawan nor Snivian is actually down there. Thus, the Jedi are duped by a combination of their own arrogance and over-reliance on their Force abilities. Anyway, while he was napping, Zayne had a dream, specifically a memory of the last training assignment he had with the other Padawans before they were killed. This is not just a throwaway moment here. Like Miller promised in the primer video, he would not introduce any mystery to which he didn't know the answer. He regularly sets up several things throughout this entire comic book run, and he makes sure to pay off every single one, including this dream and, in fact, the rock ghouls in the Undercity. In fact, for this series, I'm going to include a counter of setups made by Miller and another one later for when they start paying off. Eventually, the pair reaches their destination, a junkyard on the outskirts of the Taris lower levels. They find the people that Griff was looking for. Unfortunately, the people aren't very happy to see them. They are Jerael, a woman with a violent temper and very good with a shock staff, and her charge, an elderly man named Camper, who seems to militate between moments of brilliant lucidity and pants-on-head senile idiocy. Neither is particularly willing to help the two fugitives, but then the Jedi and Taris official security forces arrive and the decision is effectively made for them, as there's no way Lucien and the others are going to let anyone live whom Zayne might have told the truth about the Padawan massacre. Luckily, Camper is in one of his more lucid moments as he's able to evade Taris security and the Jedi by firing up the Last Resort, his old junk hauler, which was so covered in trash that it looked like a house. Even then, it's a near escape, and they only manage this by hiding in an asteroid field, because in Star Wars, unlike real life, asteroids are close enough to actually make it hazardous for ships of any size to follow them. But this is ultimately a delaying tactic. Eventually, they'll have to leave, and the enemy will be waiting for them to do just that. While they're trying to come up with a new plan, Camper goes senile again, and Jarail has to look after him. Griff decides to find a place to take a nap, and Zayne decides to be an idiot and briefly take the ship out of the asteroid field just long enough to try and contact Old Master Vandar on Dantooine. Unfortunately, by now the official version of what happened at the Padawan massacre has gotten out, and Master Vandar is no more convinced of Zayne's innocence than most. Granted, he is willing to concede the possibility that Zayne may not have known what he was doing, that he might have even briefly fallen under the influence of the dark side. Certainly, he seems to think that's more believable than the idea that 5 Jedi Masters would deliberately kill the Padawans entrusted to their care. Before Zayne can plead his case some more, Jarail knocks him out for being an idiot and takes the ship back into the asteroid field. However, the interrupted conversation does give Zayne an idea. One of the details brought up in the conversation with Master Vandar is the fact that of the 5 Jedi Masters assigned to Taris, Masters Kanilia, Zamar, Feln, and Rana Te are all powerful Jedi consulars, especially gifted with Jedi foresight. This is actually a direct reference to the old Star Wars RPG created by West End Games. I don't know if this is relevant to the current Star Wars RPG by Fantasy Flight, but back in the West End version, players could choose 3 specific classes if they wanted to be a Jedi Knight: Jedi Consular, Jedi Guardian, and Jedi Sentinel. Jedi Consulars specialized in the more cerebral aspects of the Force and the Jedi Code, taking on the roles of healers, lore keepers, and seers. Guardians specialized in the more martial aspects, not only as lightsaber duelists, but as pilots, for example, with the Sentinel serving as the middle-of-the-road jack-of-all-trades class. The point of all this is that Zayne begins to think, given that 4 of the Taris Masters were seers, then perhaps they were motivated to kill the Padawans because they saw something in a vision. Then, recalling the dream that he had while he was on the run with Griff, Zayne has Jarail take the last resort to the last place he and the other Padawans were with their masters before the knighting ceremony was announced: the Rogue Moon. The best way that I can sum up what the Rogue Moon is that it's basically a dwarf planetoid like Ceres, which is actually a real interstellar body in our own asteroid field. It's small, has low gravity, and most importantly of all, has no atmosphere to burn up any falling debris, which means it's constantly suffering interstellar bombardment. Stuff is constantly hitting the surface, from pebbles to rocks big enough to squish a grown man flat. When the Padawans were brought here for their last training exercise, they were told to travel from one end of an open plain to the other where the Masters would be waiting for them. They would all wear envirosuits with the blast shields down so that they couldn't see with their eyes. The idea was to use the Force to safely make their way across the plain without being flattened. Naturally, Zayne was the very last to make it across. And so, while Griff and Camper take the last resort to the far side of the moon to stay hidden, Jarail and Zayne examine the site where the Masters had awaited their Padawans. Unfortunately, it seems that Zayne's hunch may have hit a dead end, as there's very little to find. All the Masters had while they were awaiting their students was an electromagnetic shield to protect them from the meteorites. At first, it looks like the only thing the two will have gotten for their troubles is nearly getting killed by a meteorite. But then Zayne remembers that there was one other being present, T1LB, a bulk loader droid that had been brought along to set up the shield. Good at what he was made for, but not designed with much intelligence. By the time the first of the Padawans had completed the assignment, apparently the droid had accidentally stumbled off one of the cliffs and fallen down to the bottom. But, Zayne suddenly realizes, that's just what they thought at the time. What if LB hadn't fallen? What if he was pushed off because he saw something? If they can get a hold of the droid's holographic memory, maybe it will tell them something. Luckily, the droid is still there at the bottom of the cliff, although heavily damaged. In fact, far too heavily damaged. Yes, the droid was big and heavy, but in the low-gravity environment of the Rogue Moon, he's simply way too badly damaged for it to have been caused by a mere fall. Rather than fall, perhaps he was pushed. Something an ordinary person couldn't do, but something that a Jedi could do very easily. And right then, Lucien Dre arrives to catch his errant Padawan with a bunch of Taris security men as backup. Bit of a side note, apparently Brian Ching was unavailable to do the art for issue 5, so they had to bring in Travel Foreman instead. Luckily, Ching returns for issue 6, as while Foreman's style isn't bad, the quality is noticeably less than that of Ching. Luckily for Zayne and Jarail, Griff and Camper managed to take the bad guys by surprise with the last resort and drive them off just long enough for the two to escape along with the wreckage of LB. Luckily, Camper is still in lucid genius mode, and he manages to repair LB to the point where Zayne can access the droid's holographic memory. And at last, we are given some clues as to what exactly happened that fateful day on the rogue moon. After LB had set up the shield and the Masters had settled in to wait for their Padawans, the four Seers had chosen to pass the time in meditation. Barely had this begun when the four Seers were suddenly overtaken by powerful, vivid visions of their own deaths. Rana Tay saw herself die on Taris amidst a Mandalorian invasion. Feln saw himself die on his own homeworld of Audran, right after his lightsaber was mysteriously replaced by a crooked stick. Zamar saw himself die from being fired upon by Republic ships. Canilia saw herself, figuratively speaking, Miralukas are blind, on Coruscant amidst the wreckage of the Jedi Temple and surrounded by the corpses of dead Jedi. She hurried to find someone that she had to protect, only to see that she was too late, and thus she died in despair and darkness. And throughout all four visions, like a figure of menace, was a being wielding a lightsaber and wearing a red envirosuit, just like the ones worn by all 5 Padawans. The suit itself is plain and commonplace. In fact, afterwards, Zayne points out that there's one just like it aboard the Last Resort. However, the reality of the suit, or even the identity of the person wearing it, was far less important to the Jedi Masters than what it represented. After the four Seers snapped out of their trances and explained what had happened to Lucien, they came to a swift conclusion. This mysterious figure in red could only mean one thing. The Sith were going to return, and this person would be the catalyst for that. Possibly even a brand new Dark Lord of the Sith, another Exar Kun or Ulic Qel-Droma. Remember, in the timeline, the Sith War happened 30 years prior to this day. The 5 Jedi Masters would either have not been born yet, or at the very least small children when this happened. So much destruction, so much chaos, so many deaths, the loss of Ossus and the great Jedi library. The Sith War was less than a year long, and yet it had devastated both the Republic and the Jedi Order. The Masters spoke of preparing all their lives for this moment, to make sure that such a catastrophe as this could never happen again. And since none of the visions had provided any clues as to which Padawan it was, Lucien voiced the inevitable logical conclusion. All 5 Padawans must die, here and now. 3 of the Seers agreed with him, but Master Zamar was the lone voice of dissent. He argued that their interpretations of the vision might be wrong. After all, the future is always in motion. And at the very least, they ought to contact Coruscant and some mysterious unnamed superior and get their input first before acting. His arguments convinced the other Jedi to hold off on the murder plan, at least for a little while, and then Lucien Dre noticed LB standing by and watching. He ordered the droid to the edge of the cliff, and then used the Force to push him off. Alas, our heroes don't have much time to contemplate the revelations of LB's holo-recording. Not content with employing Taris's official security forces, the Jedi had put a bounty on Zayne and his accomplices, and it seems that a pirate named Valius Ying has decided to take them up on it, and has run down the Last Resort, leaving them nowhere to escape. Griff, who actually knows Valius Ying and is familiar with underworld dealings, is able to bargain for his freedom along with that of Jarail and Campers. Zayne, however, is non-negotiable. One way or another, the boy is going back to Taris for execution. Griff can only shrug and trot out the old nothing personal, it's just business excuse, which of course doesn't make Zayne feel any better about the fact that he's being abandoned to his fate. He even tries to escape by stealing the last resort, only to be caught by Jerael, with whom he has a brief but muted shouting match. Obviously, Zayne's not keen on dying for crimes he never committed, but if the Jedi prophecies that the other Masters saw was true, if he is indeed the fated destroyer of the Jedi, a new Sith Lord in the making, his only option as he sees it is to find some rock and crawl under it and never come out again. Jerael counters by pointing out that living under a rock was exactly what she and Camper had been doing, and they'd been quite happy there. But then Zayne and Griffith had to come along and drag them into this mess. Now that they know what he knows, it's very likely the Jedi Order will be hunting for them as well. But now it's not enough that he's caused them this much trouble, he has to take their ship, their home as well? Never mind the fact that if he escapes, the pirates will almost certainly renege on the deal they made with Griff and hand over all 3 of them to the Jedi. After all, fewer credits are better than no credits. Apparently, to Jerael's own surprise, her words have an effect on Zayne. Not wishing to cause any more trouble for others, especially those who'd risked their necks to help him, Zayne resigns himself to his fate. And so, after all that running and hiding, Zayne finds himself back in the same room where his 4 fellow students died, about to be executed by their murderers. However, it seems that perhaps Lucien and the other Masters have some twinge of guilt in them, as they feel the need to explain and justify to Zayne why they did what they did. There's a pretty good bit of dark humor in this scene where, as the Jedi explain their quote-unquote evil plan, the pirate captain is just there nervously saying he would like his money so he can leave. But of course, Lucien kills him at the end because, after all, they can't risk anybody who might know what Zayne knows living. So of course they're planning to kill the pirate crew anyway, along with Griff, Jerael, and Camper. But what is this plan exactly? Well, it's basically what any reasonably observant reader might have surmised after watching LB's holo recording. The 5 Masters on Taris are all part of a secret cabal within the Jedi Order known as the Covenant, the existence of such being a very closely guarded secret from the Jedi leadership, including the High Council. The leaders of the Covenant are not identified, but it's clear that they believe that the Sith War was caused because either the Jedi failed to anticipate the fall of Exar Kun and Ulla Keldroma, or because they did have warning but failed to act upon it quickly enough. Masters Rana Tay, Feln, Zamar, and Canilia had all been recruited by the Covenant precisely because they were exceptionally gifted seers. And like all members of the Covenant, they were trained to scour the future for any sign that might indicate a possible resurgence of the Sith, and then do whatever is necessary to stop it, and so ensure that another catastrophe like the Sith War doesn't happen again. Once they decided that the 5 Padawans had to die, the Masters had decided to kill them during the knighting ceremony and then pin the blame on one of them. However, Zayne had not been their original fall guy. That dishonor was to have belonged to Shad, the best of the 5 Padawans and the one whose sister Zayne was crushing on back in issue 1. Their prepared story was that they had refused Shad knighthood on the basis of his headstrong personality. The young Padawan became enraged and killed the other 4 before the Masters put him down. Given Shad's superior skill compared to the other Padawans, him being their murderer was far more plausible than Zayne. However, the best laid plans of mice and men often go astray, even if the ones who cook up those plans are Jedi Knights. Shad noticed that all 5 Masters still wore their lightsabers, and when they tried to fob that off by explaining it was part of the knighting ceremony, Shad, noticing that Lucien still had his, thought that it meant that Zayne would be knighted as well. At first, like the others, he was happy for his friend, but then he started to smell a rat. As much as he and the others liked Zayne, it's made pretty clear earlier in the comic that they all practically grew up together as students, they all knew full well just how inept Zayne was as a Padawan learner, as well as the fact that the Masters had made no secret of their disdain for his lack of ability. And yet suddenly now they were going to confer knighthood on him? Something was wrong here. Alas, Shad's insight did not save his life or that of the other Padawans, but it might have saved Zayne as it forced the Masters to act earlier than they'd planned. However, despite his ineptitude, Zayne's remarkable run of good luck at evading the Jedi Masters has them beginning to believe that maybe he is the one destined to bring back the Sith and destroy the Jedi Order. Either way, they're taking no chances, and Zayne's number is up. Or so it seems. The tower starts shaking, the ceiling suddenly caves in, and a figure wielding a lightsaber and wearing a very familiar red Enviro suit charges in, screaming, "Die, Jedi, die!" Blindsided by their own prophecy seemingly coming to life before their very eyes, the Masters hesitate just long enough for Zayne to get rid of their lightsabers and for Jerael to take him to safety. Apparently, Griff had a change of heart and bribed the pirates to let the last resort go. As to why they came back to rescue Zayne, well, to quote the lady herself, "Nobody's ever sacrificed himself for any of us before. Couldn't let you go around thinking that was sensible behavior. Doesn't mean we like you or anything." Oh, come on, you all knew that was coming. By the way, I really like the exchange between Zayne and Griff when the latter explains why he decided to come back for the kid he's mockingly called Jedi intern for so long. "Unfinished business, intern. I'm here to offer you a position in my organization." "Your organization? It's just you." "What can I say? It's a good position. My brains, your random destructive power, we'll own the galaxy. Or we'll wreck it and sell it for salvage. But you abandoned me. You said I was a losing hand." "Aw, I never look at my cards anyway. I'm all about the bluff, remember? There's nothing better than making something out of nothing. I'd forgotten that until Jerael reminded me. So, are you in?" Of course, Zayne eventually agrees on the condition that Griff stop calling him the intern, at which point the Snivian promotes him to henchman. 3 weeks after the Last Resort's departure, Taris is experiencing serious rioting, partly from outrage at Zayne, the supposed Padawan murderer, escaping justice twice, and fear because of the possibility of a Mandalorian invasion from the neighboring sector. To make matters worse, the 5 Jedi of the Covenant are being recalled to Coruscant for their apparent failure. Shortly after this little bit of news has reached the 5 Masters, they receive another message courtesy of some unsavory character from the lower levels of the city. Of course, the message was originally from Zayne, and I've got to quote it again because Miller gives him a really good speech here. "Hello, Master. I'm running now, but I've had time to reflect on your teachings. You say the living sometimes have to suffer to serve a larger goal. I've seen how you live by that. Well, I have a goal now too. Justice. For myself, for my friends, for the people sacrificed to the plans of the so-called infallible. And it will definitely involve some suffering. Because, you see, I've had a vision of my own. One day, one of you is going to confess and clear my name. And to make sure, I'm going to hunt down each and every one of you. The one that confesses lives. I don't care which one of you does it. It doesn't matter where they send you. You have a death mark, same as me. Don't look for me, Lucian, because I'll find you. And if I do end up collapsing the Jedi Order, just remember one thing. You started it." And on that badass note, the beginning of KOTOR the comic ends. I freely admit that I mostly started reading Star Wars comics only when I started doing Should This Be Canon. But I must say, I don't think I've ever seen a stronger beginning in a Star Wars comic than this. Commencement is clearly its own self-contained story, and yet it does so much to set up the principal conflict for the next 44 issues. It gives us a flawed but likable main character, some memorable sidekicks, and frankly, some very unorthodox villains. In what other Star Wars story are Jedi Knights the bad guys? And Jedi whose overriding goal is to stop the Sith at that? Really, the only weak point I can think of so far is that apart from being arrogant and fanatically dedicated to their cause, the Covenant members aren't really that well fleshed out. But there's still plenty of comic left to go, so I'm not going to hold that against them just yet. I also have to give a special shout out to Brian Ching's artwork. It's one of the best I've seen thus far in a Star Wars comic. It's this interesting combination that looks partly like a pencil sketch, but also part watercolor. I don't know exactly how he does it, but I hope he keeps doing it in the other interiors he does. Like I said, it's a very strong start, possibly the strongest I've ever seen. But can KOTOR the comic maintain momentum? Find out next time. Until then.